for me, the biggest COP26 takeaway from a private sector perspective is that its potential to rewrite trade, the rules of engagement for trade, right? And I say this because, COP is primarily a G2G instrument, and many governments have taken up serious pledges, right, in the COP process, right? For example, reduction of methane, zero deforestations, and also maybe strengthening some of their own climate ambitions. In fact, they're going to come renew on an annual basis, right? It's going to get more and more aggressive and ambitious moving forward. Now, when governments come together like this, it means policy is going to change, and policy will then trickle down to how trade is going to be done as well, right? So from a private sector perspective, this is very pertinent if you want to be relevant in an ever-growing demand for sustainable trade, right? I'll give you an example. Like one of the post-COP immediately, there's news that the EU is already thinking about looking at banning imports of beef, timber, obviously palm oil as well, that is complicit to deforestation issues, right? So this now means that for private sector, beyond the traditional consideration of quality and price, climate credentials will now also come to the forefront, right? And that's where I think private sector needs to be very cognizant of the fact that if you want to be relevant in the fast evolving demand of sustainable trade, you must be able to demonstrate very clearly your climate credentials as your license to first to export out, but eventually to even do domestic trade as well. Yeah, I think one is that one of the Malaysian commitment is that now we will reduce our absolute GHG emissions 45% without conditions, right? That's one. And I think recently also our Prime Minister has announced that we'll be a climate neutral nation by 2050. Now this means ramifications across board for Malaysian organizations, especially those government-linked companies, because now they have to align the operations to also meet the government environmental aspirations as well, right? I think one of the immediate impacts will be is that I think the Ministry of Finance has announced a new GLC transformation program, and part of it actually looks at sustainability or ESG credentialing and criteria moving forward as well, right? Of course, the energy sector will be incentivized to move towards becoming more green as well. And then recently, TNB launched very publicly their renewable energy certificates approach, which is snapped up, I think, by pilot 10 companies already, to show that this is their commitment towards showcasing that they're trying to do the best they can to procure 100% renewable-based energy, right? Kind of thing. So this operational-wise things will slowly trickle in. Definitely will come to place. But I think the biggest shift will come from the banking side, because Bank Negara is of course championing the whole climate taxonomy. There's also the JC3, which is a combination of Bank Negara, SC, and Bursa as well, right? And the banks, right? Which I think they sit together to see what are the approaches that can be taken in terms of pushing the climate change agenda down the value chain. And in the recent budget, I'm very happy that the government has not forgotten the supply chain actors or corporates, right? I mean, at the end of the day, SMEs are also your stakeholders in your climate agenda, right? So with the 1 billion ringgit allocation towards financing SMEs to transition towards low carbon approaches, I think that's a very good benefit. So I think the government's policy will take two-pronged, a bit of a carrot and stick approach, I say, but it will take some time to mature. Just like, of course, in the budget, also the announcement that we're going to develop a voluntary carbon market, right? It won't be overnight. It may be 1 to 2 years, but I think this is an opportunity for forward-looking companies to say, let's predict what's going to happen and let's prep ourselves in advance so that when it comes, it doesn't hit us like a brick wall, right? We are ready for this. And there's also, of course, first mover advantages to things like this. So again, it depends on how the corporate views this climate approach as part of their business strategy as well. I think moving forward, what is going to happen is that your stakeholders, your financial institutions, and even your consumers, when the awareness and the understanding and the urgency of climate comes in the short to mid-term, they're going to ask, are you a 1.5 degree company, right? So just like in COVID, we scan our foreheads to say we don't have a fever. Eventually, these questions will be asked for corporates, right? Are you a 1.5 degree company, right? So that's the credentials that you got to show. Now, for this credential to come to play, of course, it must be communicated transparently, but not above and beyond that. It's not enough to say, I'm committed, I'm aligned, right? You've got to show how you're taking this kind of actions, right? And that's why the SBTI, the science-based target, is growing very, very much in popularity. Right? I think they've now reached about 2,000 companies in a very short time span, because this process of committing to climate action first not only looks at how you as a corporate contributes towards a 1.5 degree pathway, it also has a element of verification by SBTI itself. So we know your plans are real. It's not something that you are doing as part of your communications or PR process only, right? So this is going to be the credentialing portion, because eventually people will ask, yeah, show me your data that you are meeting these kind of things. And if you look at UK, for example, right, Barclays openly has a public dashboard that shows the emission portfolio of their borrowers, right? The next 2-3 years, I think that banks will start doing this. Why? Because regulation also demand them to do this, right? So, like it or not, this line of sight is already being built. If your borrowers, your financial institutions who are lending you money are demanding this kind of data points, you will have to start to show this. And it has to be real data. It can't be something that is just plucked from the air, or we simulate that kind of approaches. So I think this is where that credentialing comes to play. Just like how somebody says, I'm a quality-driven organization. You've got these ISOs and things to back it up. Climate will eventually reach that kind of maturity, and I think they'll reach it very fast. It will be an exponential growth compared to the quality movement, for example. It took a few decades to mature. I think climate, because we don't have the luxury of time, it will be very fast. So if companies want to talk about credential, they must also talk about data to prove their approach as well. If you refer to the Standard Chart report, right, they have highlighted that Malaysian companies may lose up to 269 billion ringgit in opportunity costs if they don't look at climate actions, because Global Buyers has said we will drop companies who are not aligned to their climate agenda, right? So you cannot escape from this. So signaling is very important, right? And net zero right now is the common language used globally that indicates ambition towards climate action, right? But more so than net zero, I think net zero is a long-term strategy, and all corporations live long-term strategy, right? But at the end of the day, corporations actually live on mid-term strategies, right? And the mid-term must be connected to the science-based target for a 1.5 degree pathway, right? So my advocacy is always that net zero, yes, is important for a long term, but don't forget the short term with a 1.5 degree science-based target. You should do both, right? So by 2030, you should be aligned to 1.5 degrees. By 2050, yes, you can reach your net zero. Because if you just say net zero without your midterm targets, actually, how are you going to achieve? I do question, how do companies want to achieve it? Does it mean that you're going to wait until 2049 and then do all you can to meet that, right? So I think Malaysian companies, while we commit towards climate action, I think the big advantage that we must think about in terms of credentialing ourselves is the data that we can share to prove that we are moving towards this direction, right? And the common accepted data points things like CDP, things like SBTI, and take that pathway. Why recreate anything? Use that and show that credentials moving forward, right? Now, it's not easy to do this kind of things. I mean, it's easy for me to say, yeah, I know she comment that kind of things. Yes, it can be a complex thing moving forward, right? But I think it's important that the ambition is set, right? So that people can understand, align, and pivot towards this approach. And this comes to another point that I want to make. It's easy to be overwhelmed when we are tunnel vision towards very technical things about climate, right? There's so many jargons, right, about climate, right? And sometimes you're like, oh, what does this all mean, right? And corporate leaders are just like everyone else. They need to understand before they can make decisions, right? So when people don't understand, I think that's where inertia happens, right? So for me, climate action is really not about the technicalities. It's really more about a cultural aspect, right? Is there the emotion for climate action? If the emotion is not there, then it's just another pretty piece of document that is put in place. And then maybe when this leader leaves, then the whole thing resets again, right? So how do we build this emotion towards climate action? And this is not a very easy thing because from Malaysian context, we don't have wildfires. I mean, we've not seen wildfires, right? We've not seen the sea line, seashore erosions, right? We've not seen the calamities that climate change brings about, right? So emotionally, we may be a little detached. So how do we create this emotional approach within the leadership circle to make these decisions that we must factor in climate as part of this? It's just not something that we are doing it because it's a fad or because the government is asking us to do it. It has to be a climate approach, because as much as the mantra of management and even now climate is what get measures gets done, we must not forget, more important than that, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So how do we create this emotional feel for climate is very important, right? And I think the sustainability practitioners must be cognizant of this fact. If you stand in front of decision makers and you show the numbers and things like that, they may not necessarily disagree, but they may not have that emotional connection to switch on immediately. So I think the challenge is building that emotional drive that, hey, if we don't take action today, it's not just going to impact future generations. It's actually going to impact us today, because the half-life of sustainability impact is actually has shortened tremendously, right? For a long time, we think it's about, future generations. Actually, no, it's actually our generation. So corporate leaders, sustainability practitioners, actually right now, I think we are the generation to make the right decisions to fix things. It's no more about creating a pathway for the future generations to make the right things happen. No, it's actually now we are the generations. I think we should not treat climate or sustainability very differently from any other management approach, right? So yesterday we had a conference, and a very senior leader from TCS was sharing, right? And he said something that I felt very interesting. He said, a couple of decades ago, companies were looking at technology, right? Today, every company is actually a technology company, right? Because we consume and we use technology day in, day out, right? But that transition happened because there is a belief that if I don't adopt technology, I'm going to be obsolete. My consumers are connecting to me from a technology perspective. My employees are connecting to me from a technology perspective. So it's given, right? So I think that's the same tactic that we need to bring from a climate perspective, right? I think practitioners need to see themselves as enablers. You are actually not you shouldn't be the doers, because if you are the doers, then you are subsumed to just doing the operational and tactical stuff. And you cannot do it alone as sustainability practitioners, right? I think the practitioners themselves as enablers. How do we connect the dots with the other functions and leverage this collective energy to push this kind of thing? most Malaysian companies are moving towards a net zero perspective. I applaud this effort. It's important. As I mentioned, it's a signaling approach, right? Now the question is this achievable, right? I cannot answer this because there's no plan or data to point to this, right? That's why it's important for a mid and long-term approach. And again, I go back to SBTI. Now, why SBTI is important, right? SBTI is important, I think, for two particular reasons. One, SBTI has already pre-calculated numbers in terms of how you align to 1.5-degree pathway, right? So if you take, for example, you take an absolute reduction approach, they've already calculated a linear reduction of 4.2% per year, right? This is not sectorial, just across board, right? 4.2%, right? So it already gives you a number in your mind to work against, right? That's one. Second, because of the validation approach. Now, to validate, it's not only about a number crunching. I think number crunching is the easy part. I think many Malaysian companies can do this very fast and very well. It's about having your baseline. There is templates, you put in numbers, crunch, you say, okay, there's a projection, kind of things. The important bit about SBTI is that they actually want to know what is your roadmap to this. Right? I think that's where the trick is. You've got your baseline and you've got a number you want to achieve, a bridge for achieving, right? So unless this is shown, or rather at least provided a validation, then trust can be increased, right? If not, what happens is just a very nice statement. I'll give you an example. A very recent, very big company in Malaysia has committed to the net zero and then some midterm targets, right? Now, when I did some back of envelope calculation, they actually align to a well below 2-degree pathway, which is unfortunately in the new science of the IPCC not good enough, right? So you may commit to net zero, but actually your pathway is off the 1.5, and it's not far off, right? So had they looked from an SBTI perspective, they could perhaps readjust to say, look, this is what we can put in place, right? And because this is early days, companies who say it's net zero now may not be scrutinized too much, right? But I tell you, in the 2-3 years down the line, you are not only going to be scrutinized by your banks, you're also going to be scrutinized by your other stakeholders, like your consumers and your smaller shareholders as well. Consumers, because they want to buy for good purpose. Shareholders will ask you, because now, is this going to impact us financially as well? So if you're saying that, oh, we have a target without a roadmap, that's a challenge, right? And I think that's where the gap lies. There's a lot of ambition, which I applaud, but ambition needs to be coupled together with tangible actions, and that has to come with transparent plans of how you're going to achieve this, right? And it's actually good for you, right? So I want to give an example of a non-listed company, right? One of our members, Sarawak Energy, right? They actively go around, right, in publications, and also when we invite them to share their experience with other corporates in terms of their climate ambition, they actively share. You know, we recently got a sustainability-linked loan, 100 million, and the reason why we got it because our sustainable performance target is tied to lowering our GHG emission per kilowatt hour produced, right? And they also shared it. I can't remember the exact detail, but they will share it transparently across board. But that generates trust, right? So when people hear, people understand, numbers are there, it generates trust. So ambition important, but is the trust factor involved? I think that's the critical test. Can we trust these projections that's put in place? That's the important thing. I also think another thing that we also must be very cognizant, and this is something I'm also quite passionate about. We also cannot just copy paste expectation from developed economies, because our reality is very different, right? It doesn't mean we all need to be net zero immediately, right? I think we need to understand pragmatically what is the industry we are in, how are we operating, the efficacy of our organization, because there are different pathways that you can take towards achieving this common goal. If you do not have the capacity for a net zero approach, it's okay. Start small first. Start by being this carbon neutral. I think that's the easiest approach, right? Maybe you want to test out, okay, I want to be carbon neutral, but don't say I want to be carbon neutral in 10 years, because that's unacceptable, right? Give yourself a short time span, be carbon neutral, learn the ropes, and then become more ambitious. It's also fine. I think the important is taking action. Right now, people are forgiving in terms of whatever action you take, as long as it's positive. So take this opportunity to, yes, we'll do the baby step first, we'll learn the ropes, and then maybe we'll be, and then we'll not maybe, then we must be more ambitious. Don't wait until your stakeholders cannot forgive you, and then you are caught one thing and you will struggle to catch up. I think that's the important part about these commitments. Fantastic, great, but don't forget the trust factor in any commitments and pledges as well. First, we need to have a common understanding of what climate action is across the organization. Right? The first call to action, right? It cannot be something that's only in the boardroom, only in the C-suite, or only in the sustainability function. Right? And this, I see myself in some of the work that we do. Right? It will just be a siloed approach. Right? So actually, one of the critical stakeholder for climate action is actually the HR function in organizations. So the first call to action is involve your HR very strongly in your climate agenda, because they know how to push from a cultural perspective. They're experts in that. So leverage their expertise to push climate as a cultural agenda within the organization. Right? The second call to action is raise your ambition. Whether or not you can meet the ambition is a secondary question. Because once you have a guiding ambition, your mind is automatically tuned to how do we do this, right? Third call to action is engage the government to make available data that is already there that makes corporate climate action better, right? And this is a very interesting problem I feel Malaysia face, right? When corporates talking about TCFD, TCFD, for example, TCFD primarily is a scenario building tool. I'm a bit perplexed of how Malaysian corporates can do TCFD well without actually knowing climate data or impact to Malaysia. Right? Now, this climate impact and data in Malaysia is actually available sitting in various government agencies, database and maps, right? Because I've seen it, right? But somehow there's a disconnect that this is a government set of data, it's not to be used by private sector and things like that, right? So instead of spending so much of resources trying to buy data overseas or whatever it is, perhaps spend the energy to engage with the government to create better partnership to say, look, let's just leverage on what the government already has to push this. Right? And the conduit could be the academia. Right? The academia are good conduits for things like this. So the next call to action is think about the partnerships that can be built in place, because we can't do climate alone, right? Think about the partnerships to push this. The fourth call to action I have very strongly is don't forget your supply chain. You cannot be a climate friendly organization without engaging your suppliers. And this means that you need to treat your suppliers as a partner in your journey, not a vendor that is selling you things, because it's unfair for you to impose when you yourself are not really sure about this. And again, there are a lot of opportunities to be done across this. Explore the partnerships that can be done to this. So I'll give you an example. This is something that we are trying to do from a supply chain perspective. In my experience coming from palm oil, usually how supply chain works is that the big buyer requests something, but I'm not going to pay for it. The next in-line seller will pick up and say, okay, this is good, I will do it for you, but I also don't want to pay, I'll pass it on to my supplier. And then pass on until the smallest boy, and that smallest guy has to pick up all the costs, unfortunately, right? So very consciously we said, okay, now if we want to engage SMEs, how do we ensure that SMEs get entry to things like this at zero cost, right? And the cost of transition is shared, one, by the corporate supply chain owners. It's only fair because you, the corporate supply chain owner, actually is the one benefiting most from the SME approaches, and also the government, right? So how do we share these approaches? And using existing instruments like grants, and also working with banks to create better financing for SMEs. So for the corporate supply chain owner guy, they say, look, I can onboard my suppliers to these kind of programs, which has almost negligible costs for my SMEs to participate in. I also get to see the data points that is required for me to look at scope 3 points in my supply chain, which I then can crunch for my own climate credentials and my alignment to 1.5-degree pathway. And the SMEs don't feel that I am being bullied into an action, because if I do this, I have the incentive to transition to more climate approaches. So the ecosystem development is a very important call to action for corporates as well.